Hi everyone, and welcome back to Like Maria. Today Caroline's going to talk to us about surrealism. So really, I'm going to start with a basic question. What actually is surrealism?
Well, I guess most of our viewers and most students will know Surrealism through the artist Salvador Dali, who is probably the most well-known surrealist artist we've come across. The image of the sort of melting clocks in Persistence of Memory, and he also did the lobster telephone, some really famous pieces of work. But actually, Surrealism goes back to just after World War One. It sort of grew out of Dadaism, which was another art movement where artists, mostly through things like collage, were creating pieces of work which were sort of protesting the after effects of war, the reasons why people went to war in the first place, protesting to do with capitalism. So there was a real sort of political energy to the work. So growing out of that then comes surrealism, and it's Andre Breton who basically writes this sort of surrealist manifesto. And within that, he sort of says, you know, the ideas of the subconscious are going to be really valued. There's no rules, there's no specific set medium that you can work within. It's all about images and images being open to interpretation and sort of valuing those sorts of things. So it is a strange movement. Dreams particularly are valued because obviously that's when the subconscious really reveals itself. So surrealism is about dreams meeting reality, which makes it quite an unusual, challenging, just odd film or piece of artwork or whatever the artist is working within. So it can be quite challenging for the audience.
Okay, so you mentioned there that there's some sort of elements of oddity to it. So what would we be looking for in a piece of art, a film or a piece of art, that would alert us to the fact that we should use this label surrealism?
Well, all surrealist work has got a dreamlike quality of some kind. And I'll go on to talk about that in film in a moment. But that can often be created through things like juxtaposition. So putting two things together that wouldn't normally go together, you know, opposite things to create meaning. Sometimes it's about transformation. So taking something ordinary, say a hand, and transforming it into something else, or transforming some of the fingers, for example. Sometimes it's about dislocation, so removing something that would normally be there. So for example, you know, you might have an image of a person, but actually the head's removed and replaced with something else. So it's about kind of putting very strange images together. There are other things though to look out for. Often in surrealist films, for example, there is some humour. There might be some slapstick comedy in there. We wouldn't necessarily be belly laughing like we might be with a sort of Charlie Chaplin, but we can see the influence of comedy from the Hollywood films at that time. Having said that, though, there are some quite serious themes, serious ideas. Sexual desire often features heavily, and the surrealists were really interested in the work of Freud. And so that kind of inner sexual desire and sexual repression is certainly something that features in the films. Death is another kind of key idea, the desire for death, the fear of death. Obviously, in a surrealist film, there is no clear narrative. There's no story for us to sort of follow easily. It's a very engaging experience for the audience member, for the spectator. The spectator has to make their own meaning because the film doesn't really guide us in a particular direction. So those are some of the things that we might look for. Just one other thing to mention is that often surrealism is about sort of challenging the bourgeois, bourgeois institutions such as religion, work, culture, all of those things are sort of rejected and perhaps criticised. So you might see images that are meant to represent sort of religion or work. So those are key to look out for too.
Okay. So within the genre of film, why is it a particularly good way to make a film to adopt this kind of surrealist approach? And what does it lend to film in particular?
Well, film is a really good way to produce a surrealist piece of art because it can be manipulated. So if you think even those early editing techniques, you know, cutting things together that wouldn't normally go together, double exposure, running the film backwards, all of these kind of things could be used to create that surrealist, dreamlike quality. But also the way in which we view films lends itself to that idea of being part of a dream. So when we go into the cinema and it's a darkened room and we're surrounded by people, but essentially it's an individual experience, that can be quite sort of disconcerting in itself. So that works really well for surrealism. And of course, it was a way in which to reach a mass audience. So to bring these ideas and to challenge the audience through film was really well liked. And actually, some of the surrealist films were, you know, really well received, although that often went against what the artists were trying to do. They were often more likely trying to shock and offend than actually seek approval from the audience.
So really, there's a kind of certain irony in there that it has become so popular in the film world, and yet with this history of protest and everything, and like you say, to shock people, they're almost a little disappointed that they were so popular.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So two films that I'm going to go on to talk about that students should probably go and watch are Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or. Now, both of those were created by Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. Un Chien Andalou was absolutely loved. The audience really enjoyed it. You know, this unusual film, even though it's got some very shocking images that we would still find shocking today. However, L'Âge d'Or was absolutely hated. There was all sorts of protests, ink being thrown at the screen, real sort of unrest, and eventually that was banned. So obviously that was more the kind of reaction that they'd hoped to have.
Yeah. So you mentioned Dali there. Was that quite common, a sort of collaboration between a sort of an artist who creates static artwork and with the film industry?
Well, I think Dali particularly worked with so many different mediums. You know, the medium of film would have been, I think, too tempting to ignore for him as an artist. And although Buñuel and Dali did work together on those two films, by the time L'Âge d'Or came around, Dali's input was actually quite small. So I think, you know, their relationship changed over time, and the things that they wanted to do, you know, they went in different directions really. But often you do find artists, even today, you know, artists who might traditionally work with oil paints and canvas might diversify into film just because of that, the way that it is such a flexible medium.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there another film that you would, perhaps slightly more modern, that you would recommend that A-level students would find quite accessible and exhibit some of the features that you've mentioned here?
Yeah, I mean, that word accessible is possibly a bit problematic because surrealism isn't always that accessible. Um, it's something you've got to persevere with, I think, and be prepared to interpret the film in your, you know, in your own way, and kind of read around. But ultimately today, anything by David Lynch, I would suggest, is going to give you a sort of surrealist experience. So Eraserhead, Blue Velvet, Mulholland Drive, even Twin Peaks, there's a lot out there in his kind of background that you could have a look at. So he would be a really good place to start. But again, there are some really very odd images in those films, but hopefully people will enjoy them.
Well, thank you very much. That's really great overview, and certainly introduced me to a lot of elements there that I was very unaware of. I think I'm going to pop along and have a look at some of that David Lynch. So thank you, and if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more content, and we'll be back with some more Zoom videos shortly.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio.